if you could explain what is U-233 and how is it developed, used, and processed for nuclear weapons or energy purposes in Oak Ridge?
Okay. So uranium-233 is a fissile isotope of uranium, and it's caused, you produce it by irradiating thorium-232. And when you do that, the thorium-232 captures a neutron, and that produces uranium-233.
Okay.
And so in the 50s and 60s, the plan was to develop U-233 as an alternate fuel source for nuclear reactors.
Okay.
And so there was some thought, and there was, I think, some testing done for use in a nuclear weapon, although U-235 is a much better isotope for nuclear weapons.
Okay.
And so part of the thorium fuel cycle is U-233. Unfortunately, U-233, because its daughter product is uranium-232, another isotope, it's highly radioactive. It has a lot of gamma radiation, and so it's very difficult to handle, very, very difficult to store. And so it was the whole thought of using it as a fuel source was discarded when they realized how much radioactivity was being produced. And so they collected up all the U-233 and stored it. And it's been in storage since the Cold War. I mean, the beginning of the Cold War.
Yeah. Is that building, what is it, three?
Building 319 is the nation's repository for all U-233 for the United States.
I think I read they became designated as a repository in maybe in the mid-60s.
I think it was, yes. And then they, the government, stored it, and then the Congress, I think it was in the 70s or 80s, determined that there's no practical use for it, and it was declared as excess and needed to be disposed of.
Okay.
For isotope comes down.
So what you were describing in terms of exploring it would have been done before
50s, 60s, 70s. I mean, there was a number of things that were done to say, well, if it can't be used for a nuclear weapon, is there a way that we can use it in the fuel cycle? But it always landed on the high radioactivity, which is a huge disadvantage.
And so is all the U-233 that was produced stored there in that
in that building?
Okay. I think I read somewhere it's like the oldest
It is the oldest continuously operating nuclear facility in the world. It was built in 1943 as part of the Manhattan Project. Sure was.
Wow. Sure, I got everything. All right. Can you explain what role Isotech plays in the process of trying to dispose of the U-233 stored at Y12? We talked a little bit about where it's stored. I guess that building is at 3019, and how the thorium, is that right?
That's right.
Is extracted from the U-233.
So Isotech has been a contract for the government, has been a contractor for the government for over 20 years now. And so originally the contract required Isotech to develop a disposition plan. So how are you going to take it, downblend it, and then transport it as low-level waste? So that work was done, a lot of engineering, figuring out what's in, you had to look at the uranium-233 database, look at every single item, determine, what can be contact handled, what had to be shielded, what had to be done with manipulators in a hot cell. So all that work was done. And so one of the thoughts was that a building would be fabricated right next to building 3019. Very, very expensive. And so the government asked for an alternative analysis and said, well, what are some other options? And one of the options was that we can directly dispose of a number of items. So there was about half the inventory was disposed of directly. So it didn't take any processing, there was no treatment required. It was just sent off for final storage.
And it seemed like Sarah, had some examples of different containers of them.
Yeah, so she would have shown you like little juice cans, little coffee cans, long tubes. So they're all the different, But for the most part, most of what we're dealing with is uranium oxide powder. I mean, there's other types of material, but the vast majority of what we're working on right now is uranium-233 oxide. But there are metals and salts, and there's it's called an RCPO6, radiochemical processing lot number 6. They're big tubes, and it's ceramic monoliths. It's a big chunk inside a metal container. So in 2017, because we had already worked through the disposition processing plan, TerraPower, which is a privately owned venture, asked the Department of Energy, because they understand the chemistry of U-233, they asked, would it be possible if they could buy the thorium from the government? You know, Isotech is the agent. We don't really own it. We hold it for the government. And after a number of contract negotiations, they determined that that would be reasonable, because what TerraPower wants is they want uranium-233's daughter product, or actually it's an extracted product from U-233, which is thorium-232.
Okay.
And so thorium-232 has its own decay chain, but because uranium-233 was produced from 232 originally, you just reverse engineer, right? And so the uranium, and so what Isotech had to do was to develop, based on our dissolution plan, we're going to downblend it. We're going to take uranium and basically, if you can imagine, if you had like a gallon of, in a bucket, a gallon of water, and you dropped like 3 or 4 drops of red dye and mixed it up, you wouldn't see the red dye, right? Because you've dissolved it.
Right.
And if you keep doing that, right, there's a certain point where there's equilibrium where you then change and you would start seeing the color.
Right.
Same concept, right? You take, it's depleted uranyl nitrate, so it's depleted uranium oxide with nitric acid. And this is, so it's a huge vat. I mean, it's like, it's almost 450 gallons of this in this massive metal vessel. Okay. And we just add in small amounts of liquid uranium, it's now uranyl nitrate. We take uranium-233, we dissolve it in nitric acid, and we mix it in. And so that dissolution makes it safe, because you've mixed it to the point where, just like the eyedropper with the red dye, you're just putting just enough in where you can't get it back out. And once we mix it up, we stabilize it with some chemicals, and then we pour Portland cement into and turn it into a big, basically this massive hockey puck, and that's what's shipped out to the desert for burial. And it's safe because you have spread by dissolution. You spread all this uranium-233 over a huge amount of liquid, and then you solidify it. So that's what we do.
Okay.
Well, part of that process, I mean, is relatively simple, right? You take your oxide powder, you pour in nitric acid, mix it up, dissolve it, filter it out to make sure that you don't have any contaminants in there. And the added step, this thorium extraction step, is we run it through an ion exchange column, and the thorium sticks to this resin, and the uranium pours through. And that's what we call it adduction. We suck it into a recirculation pipe, and it goes into this big tank. And so we've done our part about getting rid of the uranium. Now we've got the thorium stuck to a resin column, and through some basic chemistry, we've reduced that to a salt, a chloride salt, by mixing hydrochloric acid to it. And that salt is then shipped in a heavily shielded container out to TerraPower. Uranium-233 decays over time, and it produces actinium-225. And actinium-225 is a great isotope for targeted alpha therapy. It's got a pretty good half-life. It is very, very effective at killing cancer cells and not affecting live cells. So we're getting rid of the uranium, which is what we're contractually bound to for the government. The addition to the contract was, okay, we want you to continue that effort, but also strip the thorium out so we're not throwing this life-saving material away.
Because the thorium, as I understand it, it's not something that's...
It's not naturally available, right?
Right.
Yeah, certainly not in the United States.
Okay.
So hard to get. But because you started with it, you can bring it through basic nuclear chemistry. You can bring it back.
Okay. And then, let's see. If you could explain, you talked about is it TerraPower?
TerraPower. TerraPower Isotopes is a subsidiary of TerraPower.
Okay,
But it's a privately held venture, and so they're in the work of producing actinium-225 for radiopharmaceutical companies.
okay,
Raise Bio, Bayer, I mean, all the big, Cardinal Health. And then our piece to this is we strip out thorium-229 and put it in as pure as we can, milligrams of it.
so is it that salt-like substance?
It looks, as a matter of fact, it's reduced to a salt in a test tube. And if you looked at it, it would look like a test tube with soap scum inside of it, because it's milligrams, right? Tiny amounts. But that tiny amount, because you're talking now at the atomic level, is thousands of doses for targeted alpha therapy.
Right, that was what really amazed me, is how you're taking that U-233, which has to be disposed of, getting these like super small amounts of thorium out of it, and then that super small amount can be used. Can you give some statistics as to treatment options?
So that's a great. So we're not in the business on the
Right.
radiopharmaceutical side. We produce the feedstock to produce actinium-225. But I can put it in perspective as far as doses and the amount that we produced. When we started, because we're operating in hot cells, right? Like concrete, steel, lead line, huge boxes, right? That contain the radiation. We use manipulators like robotic arms that are hand controlled to move this stuff around. But we started in glove boxes, right? And so glove boxes, you just insert a glove box, right? So you insert your hands in, because we had enough low dose U-233 in oxide form to at least start in a glove box, 1 can at a time.
Right.
At the time we started, the nation had about 0.5 gram of thorium-232 available for research.
Okay.
Not even close to enough to even consider going to clinical trials, right? So, but there was enough for research purposes. Within about 18 months, in a glove box, we had produced 1.67 grams. So the nation had gone from 0.5 gram available, right, for years and years, to 1.67 grams we did 27 cans. That was enough to do the research that was necessary.
Okay.
Today, now that we're in hot cells, we produce 15 grams of thorium-229.
Over what time period?
We started in 2022, right?
Okay.
So I mean, it's been this effort. So we are well on pace, and our contractual requirement is to produce 40 grams. Now, a gram of thorium, right? And we provide it in, like 250 milligram,
Quantities.
test tubes to them, which is sufficient for them to do the research, but is now in human clinical trials, because now there's enough to be used, to be tested, so the research to be done, and then for them to produce the radiochemistry necessary to put it into, to clear through the FDA in order to, put it into humans and test it. But the results are incredibly promising. That actinium-225 is capable of destroying cancer cells without injuring or destroying live cells, which is fascinating.
Very targeted.
Very targeted, yes, correct.
So do you have an estimate based on the amount of U-233 that is stored and that you have to dispose of, how many grams of thorium?
It'll be close to 40 grams of thorium that will strip out and ship off.
That's amazing.
It is incredible.
That
And
is
you're
amazing.
and when you and it's an order of magnitude, because a gram of thorium is hundreds of thousands of doses, whereas milligrams is hundreds of doses, right? I mean, it's fascinating what is capable with this. And it's really because there are other medical isotopes that have proven effective as far as targeted alpha therapy. The challenge is the half-life, right? So actinium-227 is an example. That's what the lab's producing, the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. But it's such a short half-life that you have to get it into a human so quickly, whereas 225 has enough of a half-life where you can actually, like, the patient doesn't have to be like literally sitting there when it's being, I mean, it can be shipped by radiopharmaceutical companies to a hospital and then into treatment. Yeah, pretty neat stuff.
That is amazing.
It's wild.
It's fascinating to me. You know, as I've, moved and started learning more about the lab and Y12, I had no idea that things like this were going on here.
Yeah, so the laboratory, it's a national laboratory, right? And so it is, I think there's 10 or 12 national labs in the nation, right? I mean, these are the flagships of research in the world. I mean, just absolutely, because the government invests so much into research. What's fascinating about this project is it's a waste project.
Right.
I mean, our job is to take waste, make it safe, and then dispose of it. And now we're producing a medical isotope, or the feedstock for a medical isotope, and still getting rid of the waste. I mean, we're getting rid of the uranium-233. That's what we're contractually bound to do. And now producing thorium-229, which we're also now contractually bound to do. So on two different fronts, we're making the environment cleaner and safer, and we're producing this medical isotope that's going to save lives.
Right.
It's just, it's such an amazing, so they talk about, legacy Cold War waste and hope for cancer patients. That's exactly right.
It is.
You talk about recycling. This
Yes.
is like this is the
Top level
This is
recycling.
top level recycling right here. Absolutely.
So your background is you have a military. You had a military career.
Correct. I served in the Army for 25 years. I was a military policeman throughout my career. Spent time in Iraq and in Afghanistan, in Europe and here in the United States. So I have a security background in that I was responsible for physical security, law enforcement, corrections, the basic stuff you'd think of in law enforcement. So when I retired, I came to Oak Ridge, and I worked at Y12 first as the deputy protective force director, and then became the director of the protective force. Left Y12 and went to the DOE side from NNSA, and was the director of the Pro Force for K-25 and the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and also for the federal building. And I did that for, I guess it was like 3 or 4 years, and then Jim Bolin, who was the president of Isotech at the time, asked if I would be interested in joining his team. I thought it was a neat opportunity, and so I went over as his safeguard and security manager, all security. And then over since 2018, have continued to build a portfolio. So now I'm the deputy project manager. So Sarah has the entire project, and I've got a pretty good chunk of it that I manage for her. So I've got the operations and operations support, all the engineering functions, the maintenance, safeguard and security works for me, ops works for me, RadCon, training, quality assurance, safety, all of that. So it's
They're all under me.
They're all under me. It's pretty cool stuff.
Okay. So, what is the most satisfying aspect of your work for Isotope, and have you been able to see the results of your work extracting thorium as it relates to its uses?
Great question. So the most satisfying part of my work has historical context. So I was named after President John F. Kennedy. I was born months after his assassination. So John F. Kennedy in 1962 went to NASA, right? And his whole, one of his major focuses was the space race. I will put a man on the moon by the end of this decade. That was his pledge. So in 1962, he went to NASA and he was visiting, and he was talking to the scientists, the engineers, how are we doing the space race, And he met a gentleman who was a janitor. And so President Kennedy asked the gentleman, he said, what do you do for NASA? And the janitor looked at him and said, well, I'm working to put a man on the moon. Because every layer of NASA was focused on, we're going to put a man on the moon. So at Isotech, we share that story to tell them, what do you do at Isotech? I'm helping to cure cancer.
Right.
It doesn't matter if you're a carpenter.
Right.
It doesn't matter if you're a rad tech or an operator or a manager. all of us are focused on, as much as we're cleaning up the environment, what satisfies the most is that this whole team is focused on helping to cure cancer. And we've got, the magic bullet right now. Because thorium-229 produces actinium-225, and right now, all results are pointing that it's gonna be a game changer.
Right.
So that's what's most satisfying to me.
Good. Thank you.